clearly ineffective. Oh, okay. Oops. Let's do that again. Welcome back. This time is actually the last lecture on evolutionary psychology for personality psych. I'm going to keep this short. There's a bit of an abrupt break, and the lectures will continue pretty quickly, right where we left off. So this is the last minute, edit, just to make it watchable. Not watchable, but a reasonable amount of time. So, with that long ramble, let's get started. Hello. So we're gonna transition. Okay, bye-bye. Alright, so here are the stress tests. Now, I'm not saying that the evolutionary psych people are eugenicists. They're not, okay? They're just applying this method. And sometimes those methods get misinterpreted, and those results get misinterpreted. So you see this in intelligence research all the time, or standardized testing, where, other people misuse it. And so it's an extra burden on the researcher to make sure that, it's really hard to misappropriate what their findings are. Okay, I'm going to stop whispering. So here are kind of I call them stress tests. That's probably not that's how Funder calls them. These are the big 5 challenges that the big major criticisms that evolutionary psych takes. My primary criticism is the methodology. Shocking, right? The behavior geneticist has opinion, or the quantitative psychologist. All right, so I think I should just narrow down my identities. Individual differences, behavior genetics, and quantitative psychology. Those are it. Those are my 3 hats that make So quantitative, differential, behavior geneticist. Anyway, so my biggest challenge with this is the methodology, which is why I struggle with this, because it's backwards speculation often. So it's difficult to test empirically. And here's what I mean. The book goes into detail about all these kind of objections, as well as counter responses, or so the complaint, the argument for the complaint, and the counter response. So here's the methodology issue I have, as well as the counter argument. So it doesn't really make sense to think of the instinctual basis for rare behaviors. So rape, murder, stepchild abuse, etc. Those things are super rare. So it's not probably a good way to think about how those bad behaviors might be evolutionary adaptive, because they're really, really rare events, which probably didn't lead to mate selection. So it's a little bit dangerous to think about every single trait and behavior pattern as having some kind of adaptive advantage. Not everything has to be adaptive. Some may be side effects of other adaptive behaviors. So that's kind of so technically that's 2 criticisms. So that's 1. So the methodology is, it doesn't really make sense for a lot of rare events. Not everything can be looked through this lens. Not everything is evolutionarily driven. But the backward speculation is really difficult to test. So for example, I use this example a lot, how there are huge gender differences in spatial reasoning. And I can, before I tell you which direction, I want which way that gender difference is, I want you to think about an evolutionary psychology explanation for how it could be the case that women have better spatial reasoning than men versus men having better spatial reasoning than women. And I'll give you a little bit of time in order to do that. I'm going to stare at you awkwardly. And now I'm going to have a timer of like a minute. So think about it. You can also fast forward if you want to just have it spoiled. But think about it. I'm not going to give you my 2 examples. I'm going to let you guys think about it and actually add that as a prompt. I'm going to write that down. Excuse me. I'm going to write it on this piece of cardboard. Gender differences. Spatial reasoning. Prompt. Okay. Awesome. For those of you that want to see my horrible handwriting, 'tis art. So hopefully I remember to do that. But there is I think it's about 1/3 of a standard deviation in gender difference. So that's like, yeah, I think it's about 1/3 of a standard deviation. So like 5 IQ points difference or something like that. I'm doubting myself, but it's big for a gender difference. So men have superior, the average man has better spatial reasoning than the average woman. According to like pretty much every standardized test ever is a measure of spatial reasoning, which is actually why it's not a section on the SAT, because that gender difference is a problem. Just because it looks awful to have, like the SAT has enough problems with group level differences that they don't want to add an extra one. But yeah, there are some standardized tests out there that do use spatial reasoning. The dental exam, I know that one uses it. As well as various iterations of the ASVAB, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. It definitely uses them. But yeah, so there's a gender difference, and I bet you came up with a great explanation for why women had better spatial reasoning than men. And I bet it was equally compelling to you as a story where men have better spatial reasoning than women. That's the problem. We can come up with an interpretation to explain our data. It's really easy to do. We're creative folks, we're smart, and so the challenge is that you can do that and like come up with a compelling, so which is it? Probably neither. So it's difficult to test empirically when you get into like more like distant relations from sex. So like sex, reproduction, mating behavior, those are easier to link. So yeah, that's also a bit of my problem with it. But so here's counter response to the methodology issue. Alternative explanations are always possible. It is not just evolutionary psych. And that is very true. This is a pervasive problem in psychology. And so evolutionary psych's counter argument to all this like backward speculation is, yeah, but everybody does it, so don't criticize us. Which I guess is now in every area you can test these specific predictions for the most part, although some like you need to be able to manipulate the trait or like manipulate the situation to drive the effect. It's possible, but sometimes it's really hard to do. Like the spatial reasoning one, I cannot come up with a way to empirically confirm that hypothesis. But that's why I'm not an evolutionary psychologist. So, and this is, again, I find this the least compelling counter argument. So, and like, I know I'm still like just laying it on with evolutionary psych. I know. And we're only like 2 slides in. But there's a lot here, right? And so and also, like, just because it's my opinion, I want you to, like, look at the evidence. And so, like, there's additional counter arguments. The book goes into great detail, but most of the rest of these are really compelling. The counter arguments too. I just don't buy that, oh, well, everybody does it, so it's okay. No, that just means other fields suck too. But yeah, now you can test a lot of these. So anytime you can test these specific predictions, and that's awesome. I love it when they do that. But it's really hard to do for certain things. So we're just stuck with these backward speculations. So that's the first one. Next, we got reproductive instinct. It's this idea that, okay, so like reproduction, not every person wants kids. Like I think it's 1 in 5 women now don't want kids, or 1 in 6. It's a decent chunk in the United States. I don't want them. I've got my hands full with my lovely nieces, who are great. I love them dearly, but I also love that I can leave. And I got my hands full with cats, and teaching all you. But yeah, so reproductive instinct. Not everything is about sex. Although marketing would have you believe it is. So not everybody wants to have as many children as possible. Ooh. But here's the counter argument, and this one I find fairly compelling. People don't have to consciously try to do what's evolutionary adaptive, but it still happens. Like, if I look at my dating behavior, I tend to date, it differs by gender, actually, which is kind of fascinating. So in men, I tend to date those that are older and more established, so classic evolutionary psych. And when I date women, they're usually about the same career stage as me. Which, yeah, it's kind of interesting. So my behavior is pretty like my dating and attraction levels match on with evolutionary psych. Okay, so that's way too much information about me, but we're gonna keep it in. Yay! So third one is conservatism. Conservatism implies that what the current behavioral order was inevitable. And that it's unchangeable and and that it's the correct way, including like men being promiscuous and having aggressive tendencies. And honestly, the counter to this is, so what? That's not the point. It's essentially saying, yeah, what about it? So it's not relevant, because it doesn't matter if something natural, just because something is natural doesn't mean it has to be good. This is a fallacy. And so while it's true that, there's some piece of, it implies that it's inevitable and unchangeable, but like, does it really? Because it doesn't. We see gender differences and changes over time in dating behaviors across countries and cultures. So with this argument, it's kind of like, what you talking about? That's irrelevant. But it's an argument that comes up a lot. Okay. Cool. So human flexibility. We're on the last two. And then, so people are more flexible. So here's the argument. The argument is that people are more flexible than evolution and genetically determined behavior account for. We're complex. But honestly, we probably evolved to behave flexibly and to be able to overcome these innate urges. So, and this is almost another fallacy, not exactly, but it's this idea that like there's a one-on-one relationship between genes and like everything. No, it's not. Some of this can be culturally transmitted, which is the next one. So you could easily and compellingly argue that we evolved to be flexible, so that it's not just a if-then statement. If you see bear, you run. No, because then every toy store you pass by, like, there would never be a market for teddy bears. So no, we can behave flexibly, and we can overcome our innate urges, those impulsive instincts. We can take a step back and pause. So yeah, so that's that one. Here's the last one. And the unit after this is cultural psych, which is kind of often the gene versus environment debate gets pitted against like cross-cultural. I don't think it needs to, but people do. But not at the level of person versus situation debate, where it was like a battle for like survival of the fields. No, like the environmental psych people and the culture, like the all about the experiences, there's not this infighting. There wasn't like a decimation of jobs. But yeah, so is it biology or social structure? And honestly, it's probably both. So, sex differences may be caused by social structure. So your access to Legos may be so as a kid, you may only have been exposed to Legos if you're a boy. And so that could drive differences in spatial reasoning. And that exposure is all cultural. So sex differences may be caused by social structure. And what are these aspects of social structure? Like that men tend to be warriors, rulers, and the controller of resources, while women tend to stay near the home to bear and raise those kiddos. Can be used to explain differences in mate preferences, sure, but well, yeah, so it could just be economics that are driving this. So, when you don't have enough, like when you can't get your own job, or like men are the holders of resources, what you gonna do? I mean, either like make your own tribe, Amazon style, but so it could be that it's economics that is driving a lot of these behaviors, and we do actually see differences in distributions of like different cultures where there's equal opportunity, and I've got 2 slides coming up to illustrate this. So it could be societal structure that's driving these behaviors and not this magic caveman day stuff. And so from a theoretical importance, the question is how much of human nature is determined by evolution and biology versus the effects of society? That is a fundamental question of nature versus nurture. And it's not even as simple as like with behavior genetics, you just see how much of similarity is caused by like, are identical twins more similar than fraternal twins and adopted sibs? I mean, it's obvious there's interactions between these pieces as well as like clustering. So you'll find that heritabilities of height differ by socioeconomic status and societal structure. And in data sets where they don't have good measures of SES, in the United States, for example, you'll see that height is much less heritable among, and so I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this right. So because of how the data are structured, it looks like that there are just racial differences in the heritability of height, but probably it's a confound with socioeconomic status and access to resources. So like the heritability of height among African Americans, I think is like, I don't know, like 60%. While in like white subjects, at least in the data I've seen, it's more like 90% heritable, and those differences kind of most likely don't reflect innate genetic differences. They more likely, especially in the United States, reflect systematic societal structure that is perpetuated over generations. And you can actually see if that's the case, if or at least find evidence that's consistent or inconsistent with that, if the genetic distribution, if the heritability of height like changes over time among groups and things like that are consistent with like increases in access and whatnot. So yeah, but from a practical importance, the world is changing, and so honestly, sex differences are changing a lot too. So it's not just like, oh, me caveman, me escape bear, me bear babies. Like, it's more than that. Obvious. Like, it's nuanced. And we can see these changes over time. And so I'm going to leave you with these last two little slides. So here, and obviously this table is woefully out of date, but it still illustrates the trend. So in 1970, only 4% of households had women as the like breadwinners. So the women were making more money than the men. In 2007, so 13 years ago now, 22% of women were the breadwinners in their household, as in they were making more money than their husbands. And same with education. It used to, so in 1970, about half of households had comparable education levels, and that's about the same, 1970 versus 2007. But the breakdown of husband versus wife, and this actually reflects changes in education attainment now. It used to be men were more likely to, like in households, only 20% of households had more educated women than men. Now it's the flip, where only 20% of households have more educated men, or the husband, than the woman. Again, super heteronormative, but this is the data I got. So this is even over time in, not two lifetimes, but two kind of generations. So yeah, it's a thing. It changes, and so the fact that this stuff changes, I find, is compelling evidence about the evolutionary psych findings, that these choices, like, because the mate pressures, the mate selection, it reflects the new economic and environmental realities. So yeah, okay, here's the last one, and I don't know why Funder poses this as a question, because it's not ever gonna be a thing. So will biology, but I wanted to include it because if I didn't acknowledge it, what's it gonna do? So will biology replace psychology? No. This is implicit in the idea that personality is rooted in biology. And so this idea of biological reductionism is that everything of the mind can be reduced to biology. Just if we understand it enough, we can understand the individual like pieces, and then no need for psych. Now, psychologists don't know as much about biology as they should, because it's very helpful in like understanding how things work together. I like the fact that I have not taken as, like, I do not know enough about, I know I can learn more about like genetics and inheritance and things like that. I know I can, but like I'm on the high end of what biology, well, except for the brain stuff. So the genetic stuff, I'm on the high end of what I know, of what, compared to other psychologists. But it's not going to replace it. We're going to keep interacting. Like, neuroscience is the intersection of biology and psychology. It's along with biopsych, also the intersection of bio and psych. Psychology needs to know more. But the last little piece so biology leaves out a lot of psych and doesn't really ask many important psychological questions. Like, what are people thinking? How are people influenced by the environment, by other people? So yeah, this is not an issue. I don't know why Funder puts it in the book. But because he does, I have to cover it. Anyway, yeah, that's it. We're done with evolutionary psych, and we're done with the second third of the class. Awesome. I will wrap it up here, because I know it's getting long. I'm going to try and cut out some little to keep it short. But yeah, bye-bye. I will see you in the next module.